Over the past few weeks, we've seen a deeply troubling surge in anti-Semitic attacks across Europe and North America. Explosions at synagogues, arson attacks, shootings, and the firebombing of Jewish community ambulances in London. These incidents are happening at a moment when global tensions are running high, and with the Iran war in the background, it seems the narratives are getting more extreme and spilling over into real-world hate crimes.
We've been monitoring, a raised threat profile, particularly against Jewish communities in Europe and North America for some time, and really pretty consistently since the October 7th attack, we've really been tracking this kind of escalated set of threats. Whenever there is a flare-up of violence in the Middle East and a rise in conflict, we unfortunately see a downstream effect on communities beyond the region, and unfortunately the latest conflict in Iran is only fit that pattern.
So today, we're asking, why does a conflict thousands of kilometers away lead to attacks on Jewish communities here in Europe, the US and Canada? What is driving this wave of extremism, and what can be done about it? To help us answer those questions, we're joined by Milo Comerford from the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. He's one of Europe's leading experts on extremism, radicalization, and the narratives that take shape during geopolitical crises.
One of the sort of fundamental elements of modern day anti-Semitism is really that close association of the actions of the Israeli state with Jewish communities writ large, and really associating Jews with the actions of a state actor. And we've seen in some of the propaganda around recent attacks, the kind of permeability, if you like, between Israel and Judaism in how this violence is justified and framed. Data collected by the Community Security Trust in the UK has shown historic levels of anti-Semitic incidents for the past 3 years post October 7th. But really, the last couple of weeks have been especially acute. And I know that there are huge concerns around the security of Jewish institutions, of synagogues, of schools, and that there have been concerns for a long time, and there have been examples of targeting that appears to be state-backed, that has been escalating over recent years. But the level of coordination that we've seen in the last couple of weeks is new, and I think it suggests a heightened threat landscape.
So what do the attackers aim to achieve with these acts of violence?
Fundamentally, it's about rising fears within the community. It's contributing to the sort of chilling effect of communities feeling safe and able to express themselves and sort of play a full part in civil society. And it's really to create that sort of fundamental terror and that sort of feeling of helplessness. So on the sort of psychological level, that's really what it's designed for. I think what's notable about many of these attacks, perhaps compared to terrorist attacks as traditionally defined, they seem to be sort of targeting infrastructure and kind of vehicles and so on, and not necessarily people, at least at the moment. So we've seen many anti-Semitic attacks that are targeting Jews themselves. In this case, they seem perhaps designed, this latest wave, striking in the middle of the night, targeting sort of high profile and sort of important community infrastructure. But in this case, it does seem to be more about driving fear. I would say more generally, this is seemingly geared towards generating propaganda. More and more these kind of groups are operating in a way that is designed to attract attention, to attract reporting, clipping together videos and footage of arsons and so on. So in some ways, while the attacks themselves are consequential, it's about the effect and the impact of them and the way that these can be packaged up and turned into sort of online content to sort of further the propaganda aims of these groups.
In London, ambulances belonging to a Jewish organization were set on fire this Monday. They were parked next to a synagogue. The police are treating it as an anti-Semitic hate crime. In Amsterdam, an explosion damaged a Jewish school. A parent who has 5 daughters studying there says he would only go out into the city wearing a bulletproof vest. In Antwerp, a car was burnt in the Jewish quarter, for which 2 minors are the main suspects. A group has taken responsibility for the attack and claimed that they also carried out the arson attack on a synagogue in Liège. We don't yet know who is ultimately behind these violent attacks, but Milo Comerford says the way they are likely being recruited is very different nowadays.
I think that the model that we might have thought about perhaps 10 years ago when you were looking at people traveling over to Iraq and Syria to join a group like ISIS was a sort of, an idea of radicalization where someone might be exposed to specific extremist ideas. They might be socialized into them through peer networks or, through specific institutions. And, maybe there was an online dimension to, someone's recruitment or radicalization that might sort of ultimately bring them to fight for a group like ISIS. In this case, I think, we will see when we find out more about the individuals, and a number of individuals have been arrested associated with these attacks, including some younger teenagers, but also in the UK recently, 2 men in their 40s, so slightly different demographics. But certainly in the kind of younger radicalization profile we've seen, there's less of that kind of long, sort of slow transition of someone towards an extremist ideology. And actually very often it's a bit more of a sort of transactional relationship. So it's someone, who might be targeted because, they're looking for money or they're looking for a kind of specific opportunity. And this going beyond just, Iran, we've seen this sort of hybrid threat methodology used by other state actors, including Russia. We've seen a number of Russian activities throughout Europe that have used this kind of tactic, including against Ukraine. Iran have used it against Israel as well. But things like arson attacks that have taken place across Europe have adopted a similar methodology. And it is, recruiting individuals through platforms like Telegram. It's about, coordinating with them and paying them through cryptocurrencies. So it's, not to undermine the fact that there may well be an ideological dimension here, and this may be, to represent a sort of, a form of extremist violence. I think the methodologies that we've seen recently that seem similar to this are slightly more, sort of financial and opportunistic in nature.
In response to anti-Semitic attacks, Belgium has deployed soldiers across the country to protect Jewish communities. But are governments across Europe doing enough to make them feel safe? A recent study by the European Commission showed a growing number of people, over half, see anti-Semitism as a problem in their country. 62% believe that anti-Semitic attitudes manifest in hostility against Jewish people on the streets and in other public spaces. 61% also see it in the form of graffiti, vandalism, and on the internet. And the recent violent attacks make it clear the threat is evolving faster than authorities can respond.
So I think at the moment, these kind of attacks are really falling into the cracks when it comes to attempts to prevent them, in terms of understanding, potentially vulnerable individuals who might be being drawn into this kind of violence. Many of these countries have, relatively sophisticated counter-extremism infrastructure from a policy perspective. They are trying to engage with vulnerable young people through programs. They are, there's counter-terrorism law enforcement that is about preventing large-scale attacks, which are very familiar to us across Europe. But this kind of threat, as I said, the sort of hybrid threat that comes between state actor threats and extremist threats is very challenging. And authorities all across Europe are struggling with what the correct approach is. They don't necessarily have the toolkit required to, to be able to anticipate and respond to these challenges. And I think just to make this, really concrete, I think more and more of the caseload of law enforcement, including in the UK and in Europe, that was traditionally counterterrorism, is increasingly dealing with these more state-backed threats, which they're not necessarily designed to deal with. They're very much looking for self-started individuals, people who are kind of being drawn into online networks. They're not looking for those with the resources of states behind them who are looking to reach vulnerable people and activate them towards acts of violence. So it's a different threat vector.
I asked Milo Comerford what that toolkit would have to be. What do authorities need to do most urgently to neutralize this new hybrid threat?
So there's a spectrum of interventions that are going to be required for these kind of challenges. Again, to use the example from counter-extremism, there's been a long attempt to do, prevention work that is about essentially addressing some of the conditions that are fostering this violence, that are about addressing some of the root causes that are being manipulated by extremists and helping recruitment. But also, reaching, for example, into vulnerable communities with targeted counter-messaging and other forms of communications that can, that can provide people with an alternative, provide them with the support that they might need, are able to identify those that are at particular risk and provide them, access to relevant services. And then, of course, when it comes to if you like, more acute threats, there's a lot of research into, for example, de-radicalization and disengagement with these kind of groups that I think could be applied here. So when you've got someone that is on the cusp of carrying out an act of violence, what are the ways that you can bring them back from the brink? What are the ways that you can provide another set of incentives, that kind of ensure that they're not weaponizing grievances and targeting communities in European countries. So there is a whole set of infrastructure that currently isn't really being applied to these kinds of threats. And I think, if you like, the plane is being built as it's being flown, as we're seeing these new kind of risks emerging across Europe.
As we've heard, the threat is shifting quickly, and so too must the systems meant to keep people safe. We'll be watching closely to see how that evolves. I'm Nehal Jory. That's a wrap for now.